Welcome, everyone. This is our first webinar in the Fall 2024 New York State World Languages Professional Learning Series. My name is Candace Black, and I'm your World Language Associate in the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages of the New York State Education Department. Welcome to Creating a Proficiency Mindset in Your World Language Classroom by Elise Michael Brown. This webinar is designed to get you feeling comfortable with creating a proficiency mindset in your world language classroom. The presenter will discuss strategies for introducing students to the three modes of communication and familiarizing them with what they are expected to be able to do in each mode at their proficiency level and beyond. She will demonstrate how to reinforce the proficiency mindset by consistently applying common, standards-aligned rubrics to each performance task. The presenter will share examples of these rubrics with informal and formal performance tasks. With the proficiency mindset, your students will go from asking, is this 100% to, is this intermediate low? I would like to introduce our presenter today, Ms. Elise Michael Brown. Elise is a dedicated educator who teaches 8th and 9th grade French at North Syracuse, inspiring students with her passion for language and culture. She holds a bachelor's degree in French and a master's degree in curriculum development and instructional technology, reflecting her commitment to effective and innovative teaching practices. Beyond the classroom, Elise has demonstrated strong leadership within the language education community by serving as vice president, past president, and social media chair of LECNI, where she has contributed significantly to promoting language education and professional development among her peers. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Elise to begin this webinar.
Hello, everybody. A couple of announcements before we start. So we have the Fall 2024 World Language Professional Learning for Modern Languages. Okay. These are the rest of the fall series. And if you notice, there is one on election day that is all day long. So especially if your district has a PD day on election day, that might be perfect for you. Okay. And then we have the same thing for classical languages as well. They also have a all day workshop on election day. All right. Okay, everyone, welcome to Creating a Proficiency Mindset in the World Language Classroom. Okay, like Candy introduced me, I'm Elise McHale Brown. I teach at North Syracuse CSD. I teach 8th and 9th grade. Okay, a couple of reminders of what some of the symbols mean that you'll see on the slideshow. Mute your microphone. I'm sure you guys already did that, so we're all set there. Just remember to stay muted the whole time. A blue speech bubble will invite you to think alone when prompted. A green bubble would invite you to write in the chat box. And a yellow folder is going to let you know that the resource on the slide will be available afterwards in the shared resources folder. Okay. So today's goals, we have 3 goals here. Number 1, I can familiarize my students with the 3 modes of communication. Number 2, I can familiarize my students with the path to proficiency and where they're expected to be on that path. And number 3, I can create consistent language and expectations for how student proficiency is assessed formally and informally in my classroom. First thing, I want to give you a little context so you know where all of my examples and activities are coming from. Like Candy said, I teach French 1B and 2, that's 8th and 9th grade. My examples that I'm using for this particular presentation are at the checkpoint A novice high level, with a little bit of, I'll talk about intermediate low a little bit there. We have kind of made the shift over in my curriculum to thematic units. And using department-wide rubrics and language. This is one of the most important things, and I will be discussing this later, that my department took the time to make rubrics from novice low all the way up to advanced high that we could use in French and Spanish in every level. I'm going to show you some formal formative assessments, but I do do 3-part summative assessments, assess a little bit differently, that I won't really show you today. I'm mostly focusing on the classwork and classroom aspect. All right. So let's talk a little bit about my process, okay? Because it was kind of a process to get here. It may seem like a big undertaking, but I promise you, you are already doing some of these things already, and it might just be as easy as acknowledging it or being more mindful about it. Okay, so I'm going by steps here, okay? So the next few slides are gonna kind of show you the progression here of the step 1. So my step 1 is to introduce the 3 modes and their usefulness right away to my students. And that means providing definitions of all 3 modes: interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational communication as soon as possible. And I actually myself do this right on the first day of school, and that's just because I've been doing it for a couple years and it's working for me. But obviously it's still very early in September, so you could still, you know, start this now and still have the whole rest of the year to be using these definitions and language. And after that, I'm going to, well, in addition to that, I'm informing students of how they'll be able to use the 3 modes. So what are they and how do we use them when communicating? So the next few slides after this are going to be screenshots from my actual first day of school slideshow, where I do these things, where I introduce the 3 modes, we talk about the definitions and how they're going to use them. It's a progression, right? So we start with the concept of what is a mode of communication, all the way up to, well, how am I going to use these this year in French class? Okay, and these slides are actually, these are all in English here, because they're only the first day of school and they're only in 8th and 9th grade. Okay, so the first slide I'm going to show you, again, this is just a screenshot of my actual slideshow, is the introduction to my students of what a mode of communication is, and the fact that they use them all the time in their first language, but we don't label them. Okay, so we talk about what is a mode of communication. You already do this, you just don't realize it. Then I go on to talk to my kids about the 3 modes of communication, and I give them this definition, and these definitions are just kind of student-friendly language that I came up with to introduce them to the 3 students, or to introduce my students to the 3 modes. Okay, so for example, I'm using language that makes it more accessible to them. So for example, interpretive reading, think of this as understanding the message of something you're reading, looking at, or listening to in French. You may not understand every word, but you can interpret meaning or get the message, get the gist of what you are reading or listening to. So with this, I'm just trying to familiarize my students with the definition, okay? What each one means. You know, I always get really scared looks when we get to presentational because they automatically assume that it means that they have to give a presentation. No, that's not what it means. It could be a presentation, but that's not necessarily what it means. So I like to go over the definitions kind of in depth with the kids on the first day so that we're all on the same page. Okay. Next, what I do is we look at, and this has kind of a title, it's in French and in English, so hopefully you can see that there. Once we know what the three modes are and we kind of know the definition, well, what can I do with those three modes? So with the three modes, I will be able to, and these 5 boxes here, these come right from the New York State Anchor Standards for interpretive communication, interpersonal communication, presentational communication, cultural products and perspectives, and comparisons. Okay. And so we talk about, for example, I read you guys the interpretive definition that I give my kids. And we talk about, for example, well, what does that mean? Okay. Well, with my, if I practice my interpretive communication, I will be able to, when I read or listen to French, I can identify the main idea and other key info of the passage. And again, I'm focusing on novice high performance indicators here. Okay. For interpersonal, when I talk or write to another person in French, I can exchange info and ask follow-up questions. I can exchange my preferences, feelings, opinions. Same thing for presentational. Okay. Then the last thing we talk about here in this progression of slides, finally, how are we specifically going to use these this year? What am I going to be able to communicate about? And this is an example from French 2. So on the screen, you have some themes and topics that are covered in my French 2 curriculum. So we go over these. Guys, by the end of the year, these are the things, the themes, the topics you are going to be able to communicate about using those three modes of communication. Okay, so you'll notice I have a little blue thought bubble up in the corner. So I'd love you guys to just take a second, think to yourself, okay, what will your students in your specific course, whatever levels you teach, what will your students be able to communicate about in your course? Okay. Right. Okay. I'm going to move on to step 2 here. So once my kids know, are familiar with all three modes, we actually start using them right away. And I start using this language right away. Okay. So just a little reminder, these activities are for my French 1B and 2 and French 2 kids. So they are coming in with some prior knowledge on the first day of school. It's not, you know, it's not the first day of French for them. Okay. So step 2 would be to enact the three modes. Start using them, start using the language. On the first day of school, after we've discussed the three modes and what they mean, what they should be able to do with them, okay, we take a look at this lesson objective here, and this is an interpretive objective. So we start with interpretive communication, my class. The objective here is I can identify key information such as name, age, and birthday when another person introduces themselves in French. So I'm going to show you what this is, again, a screenshot of the slideshow from that first day of school. When we start practicing the modes. Here's us practicing or enacting, if you will, the interpretive mode. So I tell the kids now that we previously talked about introductions. What would you want to know about a person? What would you say just in English to set us up? So now that we've talked about introductions and the 3 modes of communication, we're putting them together. First up, we practice interpretive. I remind them what that means right away. Remember, the goal is never to translate word for word, but to interpret or get the gist of what you're reading or listening to, and we'll try both. Okay, so what this activity actually is me introducing myself to the students on the first day of school as their French teacher. So I have a whole little write-up, a little about me with a couple short little paragraphs with the basic stuff like my name, my age, my birthday, things that any student who paid attention in 7th grade would be able to pick up on, all the way up to some more, difficult sentences. Okay, I start by reading it to the students and I let them write down on their personal whiteboards, on their mini whiteboards. I let them write down anything that they hear. Just in English, they're taking notes for themselves. What did you hear? What do you know about Madame Brown already? And then we go around and share out. A little bit of scaffolding here. My 8th graders do get to look at a collage of photos that go along with the reading when they do this, because they need a little bit more of those visual cues at their novice mid-level, wherever they've left off in 7th grade. My 9th graders, my novice high, I don't let them look at the pictures. I see what they can get from listening to me first. Then we share out. Okay, what do you know about Madame Brown now? And then I let them read it. I let them read what I wrote up on the smart board and see if we can pick out anything else from that. So we do listening and reading. Okay. Next up, and we go right into this. By the way, I teach in blocks, so I am able to kind of do all of this on the very first day of school, first or second day of school. Okay. The next objective would be the interpersonal one. And this is very simple. I can exchange names with my classmates when speaking. Okay. And I'm going to show you this activity. This is a very simple activity, and this is probably something you already do. Okay. Next up, interpersonal communication. We introduce yourselves to classmates en français. You're going to introduce yourself using the following script. So this is super scaffolded because it's just the first day of school. It's a little bit of an icebreaker. It's a little bit of interpersonal communication. It's a little bit of is this the first time you've spoken French since June? And it's a little bit of me practicing matching faces with names. So this is perfect for the first day of school. You probably already do something like this. But the difference is I ask the students to make it interpersonal by adding a to and you at the end of their introduction and passing, well, we throw a ball, throwing the ball over to somebody else. So they're practicing answering the question as well as just asking a simple question to someone else so that they get the idea of interpersonal being a back and forth. Okay. And the last lesson objective and the last mode of communication we're practicing on that first day is presentational. I can present key information such as name, age, and birthday when writing in French. And here's the activity that we do towards the end of class. Lastly, we practice presentational communication. Presentational may sound intimidating. Like I said, I always like to remind them they freak out when they hear the word presentation, right? That's universal, I think. But it really just means that you're presenting or giving info without having to respond to another person, like with interpersonal communication. Okay. This can be giving information in writing or write it out loud. You know, I love to remind my students what that mode of communication is with the definition a lot. And I'll talk about that a little later too. And then they try writing their own short introduction. So this is just an activity I always do towards the beginning of the year, where they write a little introduction about themselves on the back of an index card. It's scaffolded with sentence starters that we go over ahead of time. Because it's, even though they are coming in with that prior knowledge, it is the very first day of school. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. And then they decorate the front with their name and their birthday, and I hang them up for birthdays. So it's pretty informal, but it is practice with presentational communication. Okay. Next up, my favorite part. Once you've introduced these three modes, label everything by mode. Okay, so once you've introduced the three modes, identify them consistently on every assessment, game, and class activity, even the just for fun ones. So I'm totally a supporter of doing things that are just for fun in class. You know, not everything has to be graded, obviously, not everything has to be super formal. Okay. But you can be intentional about the mode of communication you're practicing and communicate that with your students so that everything is consistent. Okay. So my advice is, even if you're not planning on grading it, label it anyway. For example, a couple classes ago, we played bingo with some new vocabulary. That's interpretive listening. They have to listen to what I'm saying and make meaning from what they hear. Okay. Writing on whiteboards could be presentational or interpersonal communication. Okay. I played a Kahoot today in French 2, where students had to read a sentence and decide which adjective best described the person. That's interpretive reading. I wasn't taking the Kahoot for a grade, but I still labeled it as interpretive reading so that everything is consistent. So I'm going to show you an example here. This is a presentational writing activity that addresses the objective. I can describe the members of my family. Okay. So this is the front of the sheet here. Again, this is a screenshot. If you take a look in the corner, you can see that this is going to be in the folder. I'm sharing this with you if you'd want to use this or make something similar. Okay. So I just wanted to point out here that if you take a look at my introduction to the kids, okay, I'm asking them to refer to the rubric, refer to the presentational writing rubric to make sure they're doing the best they can. So we go over the fact that this is presentational writing. The rubric is right underneath, okay? And not only is the rubric right underneath, but it also has an intermediate low for maybe your high flyers who want to see where they're going next or who want to see if they can get there now. Okay. So I'm going to go over these rubrics later, so don't worry about like reading through the whole rubric. I will take a closer look at the rubrics later. Right now, I just want you to see how I label the assignments consistently. So they always have this, the appropriate rubric on any paper assignment. And then you can see that this is the back of the sheet. They have this scenario where they're at a family reunion and they need to point out members of their family. And you know, the requirements, I like to remind them, the requirements are just, I'm looking for complete sentences that make sense most of the time. No, I am not taking points off for accents and spelling. Okay. That's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for what can be seen in the novice high section of the rubric on the front. Okay. And sometimes I do ask them to circle and assess themselves on the rubric where they think they are. Sometimes kids just do it on their own. But these rubrics can also be, and again, we'll look at the rubrics later, but they can also be for the kids to assess themselves, okay, after you've looked at them together. Now, something a little bit different, oops, sorry. Something a little bit different is, here's a screenshot of a quizzes that I would do to get the students ready for a more traditional presentational writing that you just saw. So this is an informal assessment in quizzes. It addresses the objective, I can describe the physical characteristics of different people. Okay, so for example, they have a bunch of people and they just need to choose the correct adjective ending that goes with it. This is a skill that they would need to master in the target language to form those complete sentences in the paragraph, in the more formal paragraph that they're going to write. So even if you don't plan on using this as a formal grade, the quizzes itself, maybe it's a practice activity, maybe you take it for a grade. Keep things consistent by sharing with your students that this activity falls under presentational writing because they need this skill to be able to write. Okay, so as you can see, I took a screenshot of the title, so you can see it's called Les Adjectifs et les Personnes, and I labeled it presentational writing. I usually just do a little parentheses after the title of the activity for everything. Okay. So I want you guys to think about for a minute, what is a just for fun activity that you do with your students? And what mode of communication does it ask students to use? So this might be something that you never thought of before, but you're just being more intentional about something that you already do. Some examples would be, maybe you like to play Jeopardy to review before an assessment. Well, that's interpretive communication. Maybe you like to play 20 questions. Well, that's interpersonal, right? So my point being is you're most likely practicing all three modes, even if you haven't really thought about it before, or even if you've never considered labeling them or sharing with the kids what mode of communication it is. Okay. I hope you could think of at least something. I bet you probably thought of a bunch of things that you do. So on to step 3. Step 1 was introducing the 3 modes and their usefulness. Step 2 would be enacting those modes with your students, using that language to label your activities, and so they understand the definitions and how they use them in class. Okay. Step 3 for me would be to introduce the concept of proficiency then. Okay. And this would be providing students with the definition and descriptors of language proficiency, and introducing them to their course proficiency targets. Now, I bet you all recognize the graphic that I have on the side of the screen here. This has been around for a long time. I used to use this to introduce the concept of proficiency to my kids, okay, because it was very simple and straightforward, but it's too simple, okay? It only talks about text type, for example, using the phrasing I use, okay? And proficiency is just so much more than that. So it's an okay starting point, but there's so much more to proficiency that you can get into with your kids. So let me show you how I now introduce the concept of proficiency to my kids. And again, this is very early on in the year. We've already done it. I think we did it on like the second or third lesson this year. Again, I'm going to show you some screenshots of my slideshow. Okay. So for example, we would start out that day. Qu'est-ce que c'est proficiency? What is proficiency? We look at the actual definition. Okay, what is the textbook definition of proficiency? Well, it's the ability of an individual to speak or perform in an acquired language. Okay. And then we do this activity here. I'm going to, before I show you the rest of the activity, just want to let you know that this activity does come from my district's online textbook. So you are going to see some proprietary pieces that are blurred out or covered because I can't show them to you. But this is an activity that you could easily recreate if you wanted to do it with your students. Okay, so I'm going to describe the activity. And this is something I do with my 8th and again with my 9th graders. I did it again with my 9th graders that I had last year because I just think it's so helpful to share with them what proficiency means and what it looks like. So the activity starts like this. Cameron, a new friend, he asks a question to a group of English language learners. Okay, so these are all, well, they're all, you know, like fake people, but they're all learning English as their second language. He asked them, what's fun to do around here on the weekends? And they all have a different answer. Okay, I print out their answers on cards, on cardstock. I give them to my students, and with their elbow partner or their table group, I ask them to put the responses in order from most simple, so the simplest answer, all the way up to what they would consider the most complex answer. Okay. And the cards look like this. They have the picture. This is something, you know, I have blurred out, but this is something you could make yourself. It has a name and a picture of the person along with their written out answer in English of what they like to do around on the weekends. Okay. And, you know, it's funny. Some of them are funny because the kids like it. They get to judge people's English. And some of the mistakes sound kind of funny and they like that. But what we end up having, oh, you know what? Let me turn my lights back on. Excuse me for 1 second. Okay, I'm back. All right, so what we end up having is in order from the simplest answer to the most complex answer, and I'm able to show them where those answers, once they're in order, where do they fall on this proficiency scale. Okay, so for example, Rachel, she's a novice low. Okay, she answered with with a list of about 5 things that were all cognates and they were all spelled badly. Okay, all the way up to Daniel, who is intermediate high, who wrote this whole long answer about his YouTube channel and all this. Okay, so we take a look at this. For the most part, students are able to put it in order. They all agree. We like to take a minute to talk about who we relate to. Kids will say, oh, I'm a Liv, I'm a Jack, you know, and we talk about if you had to answer this question in French, which we actually do later on, but they don't know that yet. Where would you fall? What kind of answer could you give? Okay. And then I have some like thought questions at the bottom. Where are you on your language journey? Where would you put your French proficiency as it relates to these people's English proficiency? Okay. And then lastly, in that lesson there, we look at our own French 2, French 1B path to proficiency. Okay, so even though I don't use that graphic anymore, I like that phrasing, path to proficiency. So I use that a lot with my kids. The numbers here in the corners are just because I like to have the kids, you know, hold up a number, like where do you feel like you are right now? 1, 2, 3, or 4. This wording here is the wording that our district used on the rubrics. This is the wording we came up with.
Here it is. Come back, come back, come back. We found cup.
Sorry.
Sorry, can we make sure that we have all of our participants muted? Thank you.
This is the wording that we as a district came up with when we came up with the rubrics. And again, this is just novice low to intermediate low because that's where my 2 classes focus on. Okay. Now I'll talk about our process a little bit of creating those rubrics. So first thing I'll show you is the performance indicators for modern languages. These resources as well will be in the folder, okay? But this is a good starting point, and this is where we started when we went to create these common rubrics, just with a more like student-friendly language, more accessible. So we started by looking at the New York performance indicators for checkpoint A and checkpoint B. And again, this is available in the folder as well afterwards. Okay. And then we took a look at the master rubrics. So we wanted to create our own rubrics that were just a little bit easier, you know, to use in our everyday classrooms. And we decided on, you know, as a group, this is something we did over the summer. You know, it wasn't mandatory, but we did have a good showing of like middle school to high school French and Spanish getting together to come up with student-friendly wording that we all liked, that we all felt comfortable using, all the way from novice low to advanced high. Okay. So we spent time creating rubrics for the 3 modes. We shared them. Once we were happy with them, we shared them with everyone in the department, with our district. You know, obviously they're not mandatory to use, but we wanted as many people to use them as possible because it is so beneficial to have this common language and these common rubrics. And I can't really speak for the Spanish department, but I can speak for the French department. And I know that we all use them. And it is so helpful to use the same language for each rubric, for each mode of communication from 7th grade all the way up to 12th grade. Even between my 8th and 9th graders that I see, they are already I mean, they're right there with me because they had me last year. They came in saying, you know, oh, I was novice high at the end of last year, or oh, I was intermediate. I was intermediate low when we did the writing final last year. They came right back in with that language that we had discussed last year in 8th grade. And they are using the same rubrics. Okay. And what do those rubrics look like? So I'm sharing these rubrics with you guys. I call them like my mini rubrics because they're small. They're one category rubrics. You know, they're not appropriate for everything. They're not appropriate for things that might need more advanced feedback, but they are appropriate for a lot of things, and we use these a lot. Okay, so these are the rubrics that my students are used to seeing on all of their assignments. So here are the two interpretive rubrics, novice low to novice high. So my 8th grade students are ending with these rubrics. My 9th grade students are coming in with these rubrics in 9th grade. So these are going to be in the shared folder. But go ahead and take some time to look at them. I personally, I separated out for interpretive, I separated out when listening to French, I can understand. When reading in French, I can understand, because I just like to be very specific with my rubrics, but they are exactly the same. The first time we use the rubrics in class, we go over them together. We go over all the way from a 0 to a 4, below novice level to novice high. Okay, so I'll just touch on the novice high wording. 4 out of 4, you know, full credit. When listening to French, I can understand the main idea of short passages on familiar topics with visual and context clues. Okay. So what I did with the district-wide rubrics that we made, I grabbed the levels I needed off of them. I color coded them and changed the font because I'm just a little anal about all my fonts and everything being the same. Okay. And I keep them in Google Docs where I can easily copy and paste the entire rubric and throw it right onto the page with a new activity, any new activity or assignment that I make. Okay. And I do this, I have the same thing here. I'm going to show you. Next up is the interpersonal speaking and interpersonal writing, or flip that, writing is first. Okay, so for example, when having a written conversation in French, when having a spoken conversation in French, I can participate in an active Q&A, okay, by asking common questions with some complete sentences. And we go over that wording the first time we use this. What is an active Q&A? What are common questions? Okay, what does that mean? And for us, that means active Q&A just means it's a back and forth. I'll ask you a question, you ask me a question. Common questions are questions that we've like practiced in class, and everybody knows what it means, and you might already have an answer ready to go. And then the last two I have here are presentational writing and presentational speaking. So when writing in French, when speaking in French, I can present info using complete sentences often with some phrases, and I make sense most of the time. And that's the word, again, this is the wording our district came up with. You know, and it's helpful, especially in the presentational writing rubric. It's always helpful to point out that there's nothing about spelling or accents on the rubric. There's nothing about pronunciation on the speaking rubric. Okay, the entire point of this is to shift the focus of off of grading, of traditional number grading, okay, like 1 point off per accent. So to shift the focus off of that type of grading and focusing on on proficiency instead. Okay, and this is what I mean by students asking, is this a 100? And shifting their focus to, oh, is this a novice high? Is this an intermediate low? Okay, because I've had students ask me that, and it's very satisfying when they do. Okay, and again, I'm going to share those rubrics with you. And then once you've got those rubrics and your kids are familiar with them, include your rubrics on any assignment you want to grade. So here's a couple things to keep in mind with these rubrics. First things first, they're appropriate for quick feedback. I know they might not be helpful for you, for example, on a larger project. I'm not going to use this rubric. There's other things I want to assess. It's worth more points. I need more categories. Yes, these are appropriate for quick feedback. Of course, you know, I sometimes circle very specific things on the rubrics, and I sometimes write notes underneath. Okay, but they really are appropriate just for some quick feedback. If possible, share these rubrics across grade levels and languages. If you can get the buy-in, it is so beneficial to have that. I can tell you that just from knowing that the French department uses it. And don't forget, this one is important because we sometimes don't think about it, but don't forget you can attach a rubric to an assignment in Google Classroom. So all of those activities like ed puzzles, quizzes, Kahoots, you can assign and grade using your rubrics instead of taking the number grade the site assigns. Okay, so for example, quizzes and ed puzzle, they give the kids a grade out of a 100 based on accuracy. Okay, but I don't take that grade. Instead, I attach my rubric, whatever it is this presentational writing, quizzes? Is this an interpretive listening ed puzzle? And instead, I grade them on that rubric. So, you know, kids will say, oh, I got 2 wrong on the ed puzzle. But to me, that's still a 4 out of 4 on the interpretive listening rubric. And I use that grade instead. All right. Now that we've got all these rubrics and consistent language, okay, my last step for you, my last bit of advice is to communicate these consistent expectations as much as possible. Okay, so reminding students what you are expecting for each mode of communication creates that consistent expectations for them. Okay, so this right here is an example. It's another screenshot of a slide. This is a reminder slide that I have for my students about interpersonal communication. So I introduced the lesson on the first day, and this slide is actually a screenshot of towards the end of the unit when my students are doing an interpersonal writing, a kind of formal interpersonal writing assessment. And I remind them what I'm looking for and what interpersonal communication means. So in this case, I'm reacting to what the other person says. I'm answering questions, expressing my own thoughts and ideas. I'm paying attention to my audience, and I'm always asking questions to keep the conversation going. Okay. So, and then I'm going to show you an example. So this is the actual activity that comes after this slide that the slide is reminding them about. Okay, so I want to show you an example of how I would label and introduce these. Okay, I'm going to give you time to look at this, but again, this is an activity that I'm sharing with you if you want to use it yourself. Okay, so this is a screenshot of just the top half of the page, and I remind the kids that this is an interpersonal writing task, and this was their interpersonal writing task unit goal. Because again, this comes towards towards the end of the unit where I'm assessing their unit goals, not just the lesson objective. Okay, I can exchange information about my identity. Next I have a reminder. Remember that interpersonal writing or speaking, you are having a conversation. You're responding to questions or prompts, and you're asking your own questions. Okay. And then the rest of that was just kind of the setup for what they're going to do. They're reading a post from a girl named Marie and they're responding. Okay, I'll show you that too. All right, so underneath the intro, here's the rubric again. Here's your interpersonal writing rubric. Is right underneath it's labeled. This is at the beginning of the year, so we're still looking at novice, low to high level. Okay, and something I'm not sure if I pointed out before, but we also talk about the intermediate low performance indicator. And yes, I personally do give extra credit if they get there. If they want to try for it and I really feel like they did it, I'll give them extra credit. But sometimes it's just there to show them where they're going next. Okay? Sometimes it's there for the high flyers who really want to try to get an intermediate low. And finally, we would look at the scenario together. So this is the scenario that they're responding to. You know, we go through it. It's the same as probably you have on your writing assessments. Like, here's the scenario. Here's some things you might want to include. Actually, the person's name was Theo. I think this is from a different activity, but same idea. Okay. So this is interpersonal, so they're reading and they're responding back. All right. So next thing I want to show you, and I'll go kind of quick so I don't run out of time. These are also in the folders. This is an example of how you might use the same interpersonal activity with the same rubric, assess it the same way, but in 3 different units with 3 different themes. Okay, so here are screenshots again of 3 interpersonal speaking tasks. They're from 3 different units. It's the same communication standard assessed the same way with the same interpersonal speaking rubric, but it's a different theme and context. It's from 3 different units. Okay. The rubric would be underneath it. This is just a screenshot of what the activity looks like, but the rubric would be right on this sheet. Okay. Here it is being used in the review unit at the beginning of the year, where my 9th graders talk about their family. They ask and answer questions about the important people in their life and their family. Okay. Another way we use it, in this tete-a-tete activity we do a lot. It's basically just a scaffolded interpersonal speaking activity. Okay. I usually give them, you know, it's usually to practice very specific questions that we've been looking at in the unit. Okay, so here it is again. I would use the same rubric for this. This is in our fall festivals unit, and we're discussing weekend plans at this point. And again, in the eco-tourism unit, where we're discussing which eco activities we would try and why not. And actually this would have the intermediate low rubric, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, because this is more towards the end of the year with my 9th graders. Okay, but it is the same rubric. We've just moved up a level. So all 3 of these activities are using the same rubric, different themes, but it's a consistent rubric throughout the year. Okay. So the very last thing, and I kind of just mentioned this, level up. Step 5, level up. As your students progress, introduce them to the next proficiency target. For me, I usually level up or move on to the next proficiency level when we start unit 3, because I kind of do it by unit. So for example, in French 2, units 1 and 2, we're still looking at for that novice high. And then I move us over to intermediate low when we get to that ecotourism unit, which is, it ends up being about halfway through the year, maybe a little bit before that. Okay. But the most important thing is when you do this, to bring the kids with you. Okay. So make sure you explain this shift to the students. So here we have 2 rubrics. They are exactly the same, except that I have shifted up. Novice low is gone. Novice low is now a 0 because that's not good enough in 9th grade. Not good enough to even be on the rubric. Okay, and intermediate low is now a 4 out of 4. So I'm using the same language and the same rubric, but I've just taken out something and added something else. So now we're shooting for intermediate low. Okay, and again, I kind of start this about halfway through the year when we get to our 3rd unit. And we would go over the shift together. We would make sure that everybody was on the same page. I'm going to highlight the differences. And in fact, you can see that the differences are underlined. So the students understand what I'm now looking for and what they're now being expected to do in the 3 modes. This one happens to be the interpretive rubric. What are you expected to do now in the interpretive mode? Okay. All right. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to just go over the 3 goals again. So I hope that now you feel like you've met these 3 goals. I can familiarize my students with the 3 modes of communication. I can familiarize my students with the path to proficiency and where they are expected to be on that path. And I can create consistent language and expectations for how student proficiency is assessed formally and informally.